I'm just going to, everyone knows Anne, I believe. She's on the board. And like I said, she's a woman who knows about many things, not only plants. And it's been my pleasure to get to know her really well this year. And so anyway, Anne, I understand a lot of people got tomatoes yesterday, and even if they didn't get tomatoes, they have a lot of tomato questions and other plant questions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Anne.
Yeah, we had a great day yesterday. Mary was helping too, and Wendy Cianor and her daughters came, and they had grown, I think, about 100 plants. And another gal, Barbara, I forget, also grew a ton of seedlings, little plants. So we gave away probably well over 100 plants, and it was really fun because lots of people did have questions, and even the workers who were helping build the rowing club new building, they came over after the senior distribution and put their little masks on, and they got some tomatoes too and lots of tips. So that was pretty fun. Great day.
Well, that's good. So you want to start off by, you said you had a lot of questions yesterday, so why don't you start off by answering some of those? And people, if you have a question while Anne is speaking or need clarification, I found it's just easier if you on your screen, just put your hand up and I'll take note of you. And it for me it works better than for you to try to fiddle around and try to, get on time. And so, okay, will that work for everyone? Just nod.
Okay. Well, the big question I got, several people said, hey, I put my tomatoes out and the leaves look really funny now. They're kind of dark, or they look wrinkled up, or they look, they've turned the wrong color. And the thing is, it's still too cold. When night temperatures affect soil temperatures more than day temperatures. And so until the night temperatures get into the 50s, the mid 50s, the tomatoes are really not going to be that happy. They're tropical plants, and they really want to be like 55 and up. 55 is sort of the magic number for them. And it's kind of funny. Their real favorite window is between 55 and 85. And should it get over 85, they don't like that very much either. So they kind of have that moderate zone. The thing you can do, since it may not get to be 55 at night for a while, you can put them in a large black container, just like an old tree pot or something like that. And that will raise the temperature somewhat because the container will absorb some heat, of course, and hold it better than the whole ground. When you're trying to heat the whole Northwest, it's a little challenging. But if you're just trying to heat up a pot and it's in the sunny spot, you have a really good chance of that soil remaining a little warmer. And one thing Wendy said that she likes to do is when you cage your tomatoes as soon as you plant them, because if you wait too long, you can have a great chance of stabbing the roots of the plant, which is not what you want to do. So when you plant your tomato, you put your cage in right then. And then she takes a plastic bag like this, which is translucent, not transparent, and she will drape it over the cage. She cuts the bottom off, drape it over the cage, and you'll tape it or staple it, and it just makes like a sleeve. And as long as the temperature is a little bit lower, it will help. It'll be like a little blankie at night, not too much, and not, it won't heat it up too high. And of course, you leave the top open to vent. The other question I got a lot about was like how to plant them in the first place. So I brought one in to show you how to prune it. And the thing about tomatoes is that they will root all along the stem. If you look at the tomato stems, they're hairy, right? And every one of those little hairs has the potential to turn into a root. So when you plant them deep, all those little hairs turn into roots, and you get a very strong, sturdy base stem, which is less likely to blow over in the wind. Stronger and sturdier stems means a much healthier, more resilient plant. Does that make sense? So here's this beautiful gold nugget. Can everybody see this?
Yes.
Right? And I'm going to show you that the bottom, so plants, tomatoes have, if you visualize their main stems as the trunk, and then there would be a branch or an arm going off. And in the armpit, is what we used to say, there's often a little shoot like this right here. Can you see? Here's the main foliage, and here's the little shoot, right? Can you see it? What?
Can you see her do that? My screen is frozen.
Can you tip your screen down a little bit so your camera points to the lower?
Okay.
Lift it up a little bit.
Okay.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm lifting up the stem. Here's the branch I'm talking about. Here's the little internode, the little sucker that's coming off, and it's like coming out of the armpit. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So I'm going to take my little clippers, and these are ARS grape shears or fruit shears. ARS is the name of the company, but we always say it means always reasonably sharp. I've had these for 20 years and I've never had to sharpen them. But they've got a little curved blade, and they are scissor blade, not anvil blade. So they will cut clean. And so I'm going to go right in there and take that little sucker off, poink, like that, right? And that it's because the little suckers actually don't make fruit. They just make foliage, and you don't need extra foliage. So I'm taking all those lower ones off. And then I'm going to actually take off these the lowest of the regular foliage too, because I'm going to plant it so deep that they would be buried. And so these just come right off. Can you see all this? All this fascinating stuff?
Yes, it's fascinating.
All right. That's what I want to hear.
So, Anne, do we have to wait for our tomato to get that big?
No, you don't. This one just happened to be big enough that I thought it'd make a great illustration. But no, you don't have to wait that long. So here, this one, I think I might leave because it's already got flowers on it. But so this one I plant all this stem, what I'm going to do is take this out of its pot, and I'll put it at the bottom of a very deep pot, and then pull the soil, bring the soil all the way up to here, so that all this part of the root, the stem will become strong roots. Does that make sense?
Yes. Wow.
It's kind of fun. And with their little ones, of course, you can start a little earlier, but if you start too soon, and there's not much to work with. So if you've got them indoors, they often are a little bit leggy, and then you can just take off that lower foliage and plant them super deep. Plant them right up to their chins so that the top foliage isn't buried, but you plant them so that the soil line is just under the top foliage branch. Does that make sense?
Is that when you cage? Is that when you cage it?
Yes. Well, yes, if it's where it needs to, if it's at the right size to go outside or in the big pot. When you're doing little tiny seedlings and they're in those little bitty 1-inch pots, the next step would be to put it in a 4-inch pot. Because if you put a teeny plant in a huge pot, it actually, there's not enough air circulation for them, and they often sort of basically drown. They don't do well. They need a smaller pot, which is interesting. And when you move them, you want to move them holding the leaves, not the stem. The stem is still pretty fragile in a young plant. And so you can damage it by picking it up by the stem, but you can't, well, you could, but it's harder to damage it by picking it up by the foliage. Does that make sense? You're looking like you already did that, maybe. That look of stricken guilt. I know that look. It will probably recover. But generally speaking, you want to, you don't pick stuff up by the neck. Pick it up by the hair, right? Or the foliage. And that will be a nicer experience for your plant.
By the way, there are questions coming in in writing.
Oh, great. To ask me a question.
Can you see them or not?
No, I can't see them.
Okay. Well, Karen is asking you, what is the difference between determinate and indeterminate varieties tomatoes?
Okay. Determinate are more like bushy, and they tend to be between 3 and 4 feet. Sometimes they're called patio tomatoes. There's a whole bunch that have been bred to be much smaller, more like 2 to 3 feet, but still very prolific. And those, they've got various series names, but they are all pretty much going to be 2, 3, 4 feet, and they don't keep growing. Then in those, you really don't want to over prune them, because if you prune very much off those, you're going to just basically take out your whole plant. But the indeterminate means it has no stopping point. It will grow, and on a trellis or a chain link fence or on a good strong structure, they can get 8, 10, 12 feet high. And some people deliberately want them to do that and make them grow really, really tall, which is great. They will keep fruiting sometimes into October, November, if on a mild year, or certainly in a greenhouse or a hoop house or something like that. But in most of our gardens, well, I got tomatoes into late October, early November last year that were still productive. So the indeterminate ones, you don't necessarily want them to get huge. And if you don't have that much room, you might wait until it gets about the size you want and then take off the top. Now, what that does is it tells the plant to start ripening. So you don't want to do it too soon, because it will ripen all the fruit and not really make any more, right? So if you have an indeterminate variety, make sure you have enough structure for it that it can get at least like 5 or 6 feet high, because that's how otherwise you won't get the full production from it. Is that clear?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And with either kind, once they're planted and in the ground, once they take off and start really stretching up, you want to take off any foliage that's within about 1 foot of the ground. And I don't do that at first when I first plant them, because remember, they're using foliage to feed themselves. So you want them to get settled into their new pot, put on some good strong growth. But once they've started to take off and they're maybe 2, 3, 4 feet high, then you take off anything that would be within about 1 foot of the soil. And that's because those are the leaves that are going to get late blight, early blight first. Usually it's poor circulation. They're touching the soil. Maybe there's some old foliage around or something like that from last year, or there's might be spores in the soil. So you want to make sure that that bottom foot or so of each plant is got good air circulation around it. And I always mulch with coffee grounds, because coffee grounds are high in nitrogen, which tomatoes really like, but also it seems to have some ability to knock out early blight. So a lot of even the organic growers often use a little coffee mulch, ground up used coffee grounds, right? You don't pour the hot coffee on the plant. That doesn't work so well. The other benefit of that is that when slugs crawl across it, slugs are not hugely fond of tomatoes, but if they're around, they often can get into trouble. But if they go trailing through coffee grounds, it actually dehydrates them fatally. And you get these really cute little tiny stiffies that you could then spray paint gold and make little earrings or nice little pins, Christmas decorations with little hats, lots of options. So coffee grounds are a good way to go. High nitrogen.
Very good. Thank you. That's all great information. Any other questions? Okay.
Yeah, I was going to ask about any soil amendments and fertilizer.
Yes. So soil amendments, I think that tomatoes really do better around here in a big container or a big pot than in the ground, unless you've got great garden soil, like the kind that you can plunge your arm in up to the elbow. For the most part, our native soils are heavy. They're heavy clay or sometimes sandy, and neither one of them is really optimal. Tomatoes are gross feeders. That means they're greedy piglets. They like the best of everything. They want full sun. They want great, terrific soil with wonderful drainage, but retentive enough to hold on to their nutrients, right? Kind of like rose bushes. And one of the things about them is that they sulk if they don't get what they want. That's when they're most susceptible to diseases. Now, a lot of the modern hybrids have a lot more disease resistance bred into them. And the grafted tomatoes are great because the root stock is the most hardy, disease-resistant stock there is, but the scion, the top growth that's been grafted on, will be the most succulent, tasty one. And that, as long as you don't, now those you do not plant deep. You want to do not plant a grafted tomato or grafted plant of any kind so that the graft is covered, or you lose all the benefits of the grafted rootstock. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so soil amendments, I like to use, well, what I got here was from Tills. They have a vegetable mix blend that they make, and it's got compost and some sand for openness to open the soil, and it's a really good all-purpose mixture. I use it for vegetables, and I use it for ornamentals too, for the most part, and that's been great. My neighbor and I just split a batch, and we've been shoveling it into our little beds for the last couple of days. If you don't need a lot, you can actually take a bucket or two down there to Tills, and they will fill a bucket for you. I can't remember what it costs, but it's not very much. So you could take a 5-gallon bucket and just get enough to do a few tomato plants. That would be great. I like to mix it with compost. And again, you can buy bales of compost from Cedar Grove that are really nice amendments, but that opens and loosens the soil. But also compost has an important role in feeding plants because it promotes bricks, and BRIX, bricks, is something a lot of people know more about in grapes because wine growers talk about bricks a lot. They test the grapes for their bricks before they know that they're ready to harvest. But bricks occurs in almost all plants. And in edible plants, the amount of bricks it has a lot to do with what it tastes like. So if you're growing turnips, for instance, in a soil that's low in humus, they will taste kind of like sweat socks probably. But if you grow them in a soil that is rich in humus and has great tilth, they'll taste beautiful, tender, sweet with a little bite, right? So same with anything like that. So I put compost into my tomato plant blend so that even though there is some already from the tills, I'll put another, maybe almost a third as much again, mix it in. And then I'll mulch the top with compost as well. And that means that keeps the splash down from the rain, and splashing soil can be a way to get disease on foliage. But it also means you're suppressing weeds if there are any, and you're feeding your plants every time it rains or you water. I do have a little nutrient solution I like to give tomatoes and other plants. It's a combination of liquid seaweed extract concentrate and liquid humic acid concentrate. And both of those you can get at, Rite Aid or the Ace Hardware, as well as any nursery. And then a liquid fish fertilizer. And I mix them like a tablespoon of the humic acid and of the seaweed, and then like a cup of the fish fertilizer into a gallon of water. And that's a concentrate. That's quite concentrated. So you can then put a cup of that into another gallon of water and make an all-purpose feed that you can feed a tomato every other week, especially in a container, because plants in containers, are getting watered quite often, 2-3 times a week, maybe every day, depending on the temperature. And to find out if your plant needs water, use not a rule of thumb, but a rule of finger. Stick your finger into the soil. If it's dry, an inch or two down, you need to water, and water well. And that goes for things like potatoes too, which are very sensitive to moisture levels in soil, and they will not produce well if they get too dried out. So with tomatoes, I feed, like I said, every couple of weeks at this time of year, because every time you water them, they get rinsed, and that water will wash water-soluble fertilizers out of the soil. And I don't recommend those pelletized commercial fertilizers because they have they're set to release when soil temperatures get into the 70s. Now, some years that doesn't happen at all around here. And when it does happen, like the days in May when it suddenly leaps to 80 degrees, which happens almost every year, those pelletized fertilizers often dump, and they'll release too much, and they can burn young, tender seedlings, and they can burn dry roots. So I don't use those at all. I prefer liquid fertilizers because you have a lot more control over them. Another thing I like to do is to go down to the water and get seawater, because ocean seawater, clean water out of the harbor, has salt in it, as well as a lot of trace minerals. And salt actually improves the flavor of tomatoes considerably.
Really?
Some years ago, Cornell Institute did a whole bunch of testing because the New Jersey farmers were finding that their tomatoes tasted flat, and they were famous for their tomatoes, and they were losing their fabulous flavor, and they couldn't figure it out. It turned out that the soils were becoming depleted of the natural salts because they were growing the same thing every year, so they didn't get restored. So they actually created this, you can buy a commercial seawater formula, but we have the ability to just go down and fill up a gallon jug and bring it home. 1 gallon will be enough for three tomato plants, and you only need to do that one time. But the one-time feed of seawater will improve and bloom the flavor of your tomatoes considerably. Isn't that cool?
Is the
Mhm.
timing of that important?
Is what?
Is the timing of that one-time seawater feed important?
Well, you wait until they're starting, that your blossoms are well established and the fruit is starting to form, and that's when you want to put down the seawater,
Okay.
because a little plant doesn't have enough roots to absorb it and use it.
Great.
Oh, I was going to show you. So this is my container that I put my fertilizer in, but you'll notice that it says organic maple syrup. So one time when my son was over here making breakfast for his kids who'd spent the weekend with me, he saw it sitting on the shelf and poured it over a plate of pancakes and said, "Mom, this smells weird." I was like, yeah. So after that, I realized that it's very important, even if you think you're the only person around, maybe you're not. Label everything that you make strange mixtures in and make sure it says, "Do not drink" or "Do not use on food," because that wouldn't have hurt anybody, but it would have tasted pretty strange. But you never know, right?
Good to know.
I like to use a lot of recycled things. So for my tomato plant, the saucer I use is this recycled container from poultry, right? That comes in those heavy plastic containers. And I always wash those out and use them. My grandkids use them for painting and stuff, but I use them as saucers under plants. And also when they're little, you can put 4 or 5 small pots in them, and they're kind of like a little flat for them. So you get a lot of use out of all those strange things. And when watering time comes, I like to recycle some of the jugs and containers from the distilled water. My daughter has a CPAP machine, and so we have some of those building up. You can take a jug like that and poke a hole in the bottom. So I'd poke a hole in the bottom and put a piece of tape over it, like duct tape. And then when you're ready to water, you unscrew the top, fill the thing with water, hold your hand over it, put it in the soil, screw it in, right? And it's not going anywhere. Then you pull the tape off the nail hole that you made, and very slowly it will drip. And you'll make sure that each plant gets a whole gallon of water, which is what it's going to need on a hot August day. Does that make sense? And it looks, if you're a Martha Stewart fan, you might want to stencil on those things first, or maybe do a little collage on top. But for me, it's okay to just have a plastic bottle.
Thank you.
That's
Just a thought.
Oh, all these creative ideas. And I really like the fact that you're weaving in ideas of using recyclable materials.
I just hate to throw stuff away. I hate to have all this plastic. So I use as many things as I can possibly figure out. I try to reuse over and over, and a lot of them are sadly sturdy. So I have some things I've used for many years. Another thing I like to use is these little containers that you get at the grocery store with a little lid. They make a great mini greenhouse, and you can start seeds in here and put the top on really loosely for the first few days to keep it moist. And when the seedlings come, then that becomes a saucer underneath, and they'll grow up. And then you can take those and transplant them into a slightly larger pot. But like I said earlier, you don't want to ever just take a teeny seedling and put it in a great big pot. It's one thing if you take a whole bunch of small seedlings and put them in a great big pot, because they're sharing the ground and their roots make kind of a network. But one little plant in a great big pot is usually pretty unhappy.
Okay. I think I have a lot of unhappy plants, but It's too late.
Oh, well. The other thing about tomatoes to remember, too, tomatoes and beans and peppers and eggplants is they need at least 6 to 8 hours a day of direct sun. And if you don't have that, you might be able to get some plants, but some fruit off them, but really they're not as productive unless they really do get a lot of direct sunlight.
So, Anne, there's a question. How should we pollinate if greenhouse grown?
Okay, so pollination is magical. Tomatoes are kind of self-pollinated, but they do actually produce a little more if they get some help. So a lot of many bees will come and pollinate. And what they actually do is dance on the foliage and they vibrate their wings to create the sound of middle C. Middle C is nature's pollinating tone. So if you know a lot of folk songs, most of them are in middle C. You could sing a lot of folk songs to your plants. You can get a tuning fork in middle C, and that will shed pollen. If you can't vibrate at middle C, which most of us can't, like a bee. But you can use a little Q-tip if you want to. But really, actually, literally, that the tuning fork, middle C tuning fork, will do a very nice job for you. And in the garden, you don't have to worry about it because there should be plenty of bees. And if you're not seeing very many bees, you might want to interplant all your vegetables, your edibles, with several different kinds of, like sweet alyssum is very attractive. It smells like honey, and all kinds of pollinators will be all over that. Almost all the hardy herbs have flowers that are very pollinator friendly, and most of them bloom over a long period. So that's another good way. I always let some of my kale go to flower because it attracts tons of pollinators, including hummingbirds. And then if you let them go to seed after that, they will self-sow and you'll have kale for the rest of your life.
So, can I just ask a question about rhodies?
Sure.
Okay, they're flowered, right? And I never used to deadhead them. Are we supposed to deadhead the flowers?
It really depends on how it won't affect the bloom the next year, but it will affect the way it looks to you. So if they're close to you and close to the house and you look at them every day, you might want to. If they're not bigger than you, you might want to. If they're huge tree ones, I wouldn't really do that. I mean, for one thing, nobody our age belongs on a ladder anymore. So keep your feet on the ground, do whatever you can from there. But yeah, it's an aesthetic thing more than anything else.
That's good to know.
And this is a great banner year for rhododendrons. They are just looking fantastic.
Absolutely. So, does anyone else have a question? Because I have questions. All right. You know, someone was complaining that they didn't like camellias because the camellias would drop their flowers and then they'd have to pick them up. And I just leave them, and I thought that would be nice to nourish the ground. Is there a reason why we can't just leave them?
There isn't. I mean, it's a tidiness thing again. And, you know, you could consider it beautiful, like when the cherries shatter and leave a scattering of cherry petals under each tree in big, beautiful puddles of color. Or you could consider that something that needed to be tidied up. I was in a garden in San Francisco, and one of the guys said, "Oh, I really want to show you the most beautiful thing that comes in the garden." And we walked out and went down, and he said, Gerald got here first with his dustbuster. Tidy, 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 right? And he didn't like the look of the petals, but I think petal fall is a beautiful time for a lot of plants. Now, big fat double camellias, it is true that they can look kind of floppy and gloppy. To me, they look worse. The kind of camellias that hold on to their blossoms are uglier because they look like used wads of toilet paper up there. But if you look for the Williamsiana hybrids, all the Williamsianums are clean shattering, and they will break apart and drop their petals separately, not in big blobs, which I find much more attractive. Also, if you think that they're all over the path or something and getting in the way, you can just rake them gently under the plant itself and let them compost there, or throw some compost on top of them to hide them. But the thing is, nature feeds its plants with its own foliage, and flowers. So when we take it away and tidy it up, we're actually taking away its food. So leaving it in place means it's going to compost in place and go back and feed the plant that it was intended to feed. But if it's one of those things where you really have a tidiness streak, which I personally do not, you can gather that all up and compost them and replace them with compost. And at least the plant will be getting some food that way. Nature is not tidy.
Right. And we are nature, aren't we?
Well, we should be.
Okay, Reed has a question. I planted some borage. Is that how you say it?
Forage, yeah.
And they'd make my tomatoes happy. Can I use the whole plant in salads?
Well, you could, but you wouldn't like it. It's very hairy and bristly. Borage, you can use the blossoms in salad and it will be lovely. They're edible and quite tasty, but borage itself is kind of like eating a thistle. So I would say no, but that's up to you. Some people like thistles, I guess. If you're a goldfinch, it's great, right? Borage is something, it's like when many of the hardy herbs is extremely attractive to pollinators. And if you have borage in your garden, if you have one plant, you will have borage for the rest of your life too, because it's a very prolific self-sower, which can be really nice. And in some places, the borage blossoms are floated in wine for May wine. So you could try that as well. It should be a dry white wine, just so you know, if you want to do it right.
You heard that, Reed, right? And unless you want a lot of fiber, or you need a lot of fiber, just eat the flowers, right?
My mom went to a big famous garden back east at one time, and she was the kind of person who would pinch little pieces off a lot of plants and put them in her purse, which I got to say, that's not actually good garden etiquette. And these days we've had friends, people with nurseries and stuff who said plants are getting destroyed by people who think it's okay to snip a little this and a snip a little that. But anyway, back in the day, before a lot of people were doing that, my mom was an early pioneer. And she brought home these herbs from the herb garden and put them in a big salad. And everybody started to eat it and everybody spat it out. And it turned out she had put in rue, which is called the bitter herb. And it's not truly edible. So that salad was colorful, but not a good thing to do. So you want to make sure that even if you're growing herbs, you want to make sure that you understand which part of the herb is the part you're shooting for and which part is medicinal and how to take it, right? Because some things would not be good in your salad for sure.
All right, we need your knowledge. Here's a question from Sheila. How do I plant poppies from seeds? How do I get the seeds from the flowers?
Okay, great questions. So before you can plant them, you have to get them. So when a flower blooms, a seed pod will form, and the green seed pods will not ever ripen and make a proper mature seed if they get cut off. So you can't gather the seed pods and let them ripen off somewhere else. You have to leave them on the plant to ripen on the plant. And when you can shake the pod and hear little seeds rattling around in there, they're ready. Now, poppies are awesome because they have little flat tops with kind of radiating lines. And then if you look underneath, they have like a big fat pod and there'll be little arches under the flat top. And when those open, they open like windows. They will form little open arches, and they only do that when the seed is ripe. So until when natural windows are open, the seed is not ready. And when you open it and you shake the seed out, you'll see that some of it is white, some of it is kind of gray or brown, and some of it is black. The black seed is what's viable. The white seed is not. Does that make sense? And poppies like cool weather. So this is a wonderful time to sow poppies. Because they're tap rooted like a carrot, you can't really transplant them very readily unless they're really tiny. So you want to shake a seed pod out where you want the poppies to grow, in a pot or on the soil. And by just sprinkling and leaving them without covering them, they're very small. If you've had a poppy seed, muffin, how they're not very big, right? And you'll sprinkle them and you don't need to just water them a little bit. You don't need to cover them with any soil. And they should be up in probably 2 to 3 weeks. And sometimes I've had poppies winter over and bloom early because they were, the foliage is beautiful, kind of silvery, greeny gray, and they will bloom much earlier if you sow them in the fall, again, in the cool weather. But right now it's perfect temperature for poppies too. So for a summer crop, this is a good time. I grow what's called a lettuce leaf poppy, which is the kind that the poppy seed that we eat is from. And its other name is opium poppy. Just so you know that it's legal to buy and sell the seed, but it is not legal to grow the plants. But if they're lettuce leaf poppies from English border plants, why then you can. It's just an interesting little point. And when you buy the seed in the grocery store, it's mostly been irradiated, so it will not sprout. So the way to get it is to either ask a friend who's got poppies in their yard or come to the library. Well, we're not doing the Friday Tidy at this point, but later on we will be, and I will give you some.
And can I just ask a question? I'm looking at the poppies along the pathway by the church and also down by the marina. When will those plant seeds pods be ready to pluck?
Okay, those are California poppies, and they will be ready when the pods are still green and supple, kind of flexible. And when they're ripe, they turn brown. They get very long, they turn brown, and they start to split open. And when they get to that point, you can see that the seeds are ripe, all nestled in those long, pointy pods. And those, you can pick the pods and put them into a bag, because usually when they're ripe like that, they kind of tend to explode. So you can take an envelope and carefully cut the pod into the envelope, and they will fall in the envelope, and then you can save them that way. Those you can sow right now too, as soon as they're ripe. With the California poppies, like the ones at Eagle Harbor Church, there's pink ones and cream ones as well as orange ones. If you're trying to get the pink and the cream ones, you'll sow some of those plants, even off a pink one or a cream one, you'll still get some orange poppies. The way to create a strain that's got the colors you want and not the orange is, as soon as any of the new plants show any orange flowers, pull the whole thing out and put it in the compost. And that way, over time, you're selecting more and more for the pink and the cream. Does that make sense? Or the yellow or whatever.
So what you're saying is now I could go take some of those California poppy seeds off?
I haven't seen any ripe ones. I was there yesterday and they weren't quite ripe. But when they start to turn brown instead of green and start to split open naturally, that's when they'll be ready.
Okay. Should it be soon, you think?
Yeah, probably pretty soon, couple weeks.
Great. Thank you, Anne.
Sure.
So keep your eyes open, Sheila. Anne, we have a question from
I will, Kimmy.
Al is asking, I planted my tomatoes a week ago when it was hot. Now the growing tips are dying and looking black. Is it because the evening temperatures are cold, or could it be a disease or pest? And just that you know, he came in later for the initial talk.
Al, you are not alone. Yesterday, that was a question I got a whole bunch of times. Yes, it was hot. It was great, but the night temperatures started to sink, and they're now in the 40s instead of the 50s. And tomatoes really, the magic number for them is 55 degrees of soil temperature and night temperature, which are usually pretty closely linked. So the cool thing is most of us have cell phones, and cell phones have a weather app, and it usually tells you what the night temperatures are going to look like for a whole week ahead. And so right now, they're still not even, they're starting to climb into the 50s again. But that blackening is cold damage, and that happens when it gets down, because you notice it was up in it got to be 80 for here. But that night, it went back down to like 49. And that's too much shock for that plant. That's too much of a temperature range in a day. And there are a couple things you can do. I talked about planting them in a large black container that will absorb a lot of heat and hold that heat. And also you can use a translucent plastic bag like this kind of thing, and cut the bottom off and drape it over your tomato cage, which you want to put the cage in as soon as you plant it, is the tomato, because that way you are not going to cut into the roots, which is something that happens really often when you forget and put the cage in later. So put your cage in right away, and then you can cut the bottom off that bag and hang it over the top of the cage, and it will make a sleeve And you can staple it or tape it or whatever you need to do to keep it to stay on. You don't want a black one. That's a little too much. But white or translucent, doesn't have to be transparent, but just a regular bag. That can stay on there night and day until the temperatures come way up. And then at that point, you can take it off.
Great. Right. I think the thing to really remember with tomatoes is that we get lulled into thinking that it is the daytime temperature that matters, but it's actually the nighttime soil temperature.
Right.
Soil. That's critical. Is that right?
Yes,
Okay.
that's exactly right.
Okay. Well, any more questions? I want to know what the best cherry tomato is.
Oh, it really depends on what you like. Like the acid sweet balance, the tart sweet balance is very personal. And so we have, there's a lot of range in them. I personally like something with a lot of zip to it. So I like the Sweet Million, which is kind of a nice sweet tart, or the Gold Nugget is another, or Sun Gold, wonderful. Those are all great. For red ones, I like the Juliet's. Those are more like a grape cluster cherry. And my favorite of all, though, is one called Midnight Snack. And it's a almost black, kind of late producer. And some of the black ones take a long time to ripen around here. But Midnight Snack to me, has the most incredible flavor. It's really delicious. And it's bred from some of the black skinned tomatoes that were hybridized, not GMO, but they're actually hand pollinated, crossing species from the Galapagos island, which have very black fruit and black foliage, which is black and red are nature's sunscreens. And so when you see plants with red and black foliage, a lot of times that is a way to protect the foliage from sun damage. And so some scientists at Oregon State University bred the plants from the Galapagos with other old heritage fruit to create really tasty, flavorful tomatoes that have a lot of anthocyanins. Anthocyanins are what's in blueberries that makes they give plants a lot of extra beneficial nutrients, right? So those phytonutrients that are good for your body are also good for the plant, but they do tend to ripen a little bit later. And the trick with the dark-skinned ones is that when their skin is not glossy anymore, you can't really tell about it because they're not red, right? They get mahogany and black, but the skin will go from being kind of glossy to being almost matte. And that is when they're really ripe.
Wow. That's fascinating.
I know, isn't it cool stuff? This is the fun part of being a total geek, right?
You make us all so much smarter in a really holistic, interesting way by weaving, medicine and science and folklore and personal experience and
music. Don't forget don't forget middle C.
Oh yeah, music and it's just been wonderful. We still have time. Anybody else have any more questions? Rose questions?
There's a chat.
I'm sorry, I didn't pick this up. I'm derelict in my duties, sorry. No, I picked all those questions up.
No, I see one. It says the tomatoes that reseed in my garden and sprout the most have a deep violet color on the back side of the cotyledon. Are they all indigo cherry tomatoes? Maybe. That's also, again, kind of nature's temperature protection. So if they're dark, at this point, it probably has more to do with temperature than anything else. But some of them would be worth growing on. There's a great movement in West Coast hybridizers. They're called artisan hybridizers, growing all these wonderful indigo cherry tomatoes. And I would say it'd be worth growing on if you have lots of room, because there's no guarantee what that plant will be like, because it is a hybrid. And so the seedlings of hybrids do not come true necessarily to the parent. Does that make sense? if a plant is called open pollinated or heritage or heirloom, that means that you can save the seeds of that plant and it will produce something very, very similar to the parent, if not exact. Especially the older the landrace of the seeds, then the more apt it is to really be true from seed. But even those, if they're grown with a lot of other plants close by, they can get cross-pollinated, and so their seedlings may or may not be true. To maintain those heritage strains, they have to be planted in large fields that are like at least a quarter mile away from other types. Does that make sense? So go for it. Plant them out if you got room. See what they are, and if you have a good one, you can name it, Al's favorite.
Although he wrote, I have room, but I didn't really like the taste of them. Or maybe more correctly, I didn't know when to pick and eat them.
Yeah, that's the trouble, because the dark-skinned tomatoes do not develop their full flavor until they're fully ripe. And again, it's kind of challenging to tell when they're ripe because they don't have the same coloration cues that we're used to. So again, if you look at them, they're very hard also when they're unripe. The black-skinned tomatoes tend to be like marbles. And then when they start to soften up and the skin is no longer glossy, it loses its gloss and it looks more dull, that's the time that they should be fully ripe. But again, they may not taste that great because they're random offspring, right? They're probably hybrids, and some busy bee had more to do with their parentage than the original parent.
So in other words, yeah, it's a nice experiment, and if you're curious about it, then do it. But otherwise, if you really want to make sure you have the original, then you need to get the original plant. Is that correct?
Yes, that is.
I have a question about potatoes that will never stop growing once you plant, potato, and they're in the soil or something. So, but I'm worried because I know you're not supposed to keep planting potatoes in the same soil. Is that correct?
Well, any plant that grows in the same soil for too long is going to use, in annuals, especially short-term plants, they use up certain kinds of nutrients. And the reason we do crop rotation is because you want to refresh the soil and you want to use plants that have different nutritional needs so that the soil has a chance to build up back to its fuller spectrum of biota, what naturally lives in soil and makes it come to life. So, but with things like potatoes, what happens is no matter how carefully you harvest them, you always miss a few little teeny tiny ones, and they winter over happily and make new plants. But usually they're kind of outliers. So they're further away from where the mom was. And they'll come up a foot to the left or a foot to the right, and they kind of move their way around the garden. So I don't worry about them. I let them just grow. What you do want to probably do is when you see the little potato plants start to form, I put more soil on top and sort of bury them up to their necks and hill it up again so that first of all, they tend to maybe they've been brought close to the surface when you dug up the original potatoes. But if they get exposed to light, they develop a green coating, which is actually kind of toxic. Generally you're going to peel the potato, but sometimes that has penetrated close into the potato enough that they're really not wholesome. So dump more soil on, because like the tomatoes, they'll form, they're in the same family. They'll form roots all along their stems.
Wow, I will do that.
If you want to sprout your own, go to the grocery store and buy organic potatoes, because if they're not organic, they've been treated and they will not sprout. And when they do sprout, you can plant the whole thing, or you can cut them up, put them on a little rack for a few days to dry off the cut edges. And once they're cured and they're dry, then you can plant them, and you'll have hills all over the place. And it's fun because then you can have lots of different kinds of potatoes.
Say it's the most satisfying experience, to grow a potato, because you rarely lose. You are ecstatic because you have all these baby potatoes.
Right. And what's more delicious than new potatoes, right?
Exactly. Better than an old potato.
Yeah.
Hey, Ann,
Hey.
we have a camellia tea tea
Uh-huh.
camellia. Have you ever dried the new leaves and had that? Have you ever tried that or?
Yes, it's actually pretty, there's a lot to it. It's the way that tea leaves are dried commercially is pretty complicated, and they're rolled and dried and pressed, and it's a little bit hard to do that at home, but you can certainly do it. I have done it. And it's sort of funny because you really want the newest leaves and of a certain size, and you can make twig tea, which I really like, with the twigs and the ones that aren't quite the right size, and let them dry, and they have a kind of a really earthy quality to them. So it's not a refined, fabulous blend, but it's it's nice. And again, it's so fun to have something that you grew yourself and be able to, like, I take my teapot into the garden really often, and I put chamomile and mint and rose petals, because I grow organic roses, and calendula petals, and a little of this and that, maybe some dill, maybe some oregano, and make my own herb teas. And I'm growing ginger and turmeric, and those you can take cut a piece off and chop that up and put it in your teapot too. It's so satisfying.
It is.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, we're going to try it this year. It's a pretty old tree. And the thing is, I almost hate to take those brand new baby leaves off, but that's how you have to do it.
That's what you do, right? And it won't mind. It'll be fine.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
I think I missed what tea leaves are they? I mean,
well, camellia. Okay, so Camellia sinensis, Chinese camellia, is tea plant. That's what tea is made of. But there are specific strains that have been grown, and also that, like grapes, the way the tea tastes has a lot to do with the soil that it's grown in, and the temperature and the climate and so forth. So that's why you have Ceylon tea, or you have tea from India, or you have tea from China, various places. And each of them will have a specific strain of camellia that they like to use, just like tomatoes, right? So they're all the same plant, but they have variations, right? And so people have selected over time different variations to choose a flavor profile that they really like. Coffee too, same kind of thing. But not all camellias are tea camellias, and some of them are complex hybrids, and so they wouldn't be necessarily, you'd have a cup that tasted like barn sweepings possibly, right? So you want to make sure that you're growing a true tea camellia.
And are they named that at the store?
Yeah, they are. And they're not, you have to get them from a specialty nursery like One Green World or Rain Tree. They're not commonly, maybe, you could call some of the local nurseries and ask if they have tea camellias. Sometimes they do, but it's not something tons of people are super into. So they're not as popular as, Snow Queen or something.
Yeah, the blooms are very tiny on them.
They're not grown for the flowers.
No.
Well, Anne, you've been just so much fun, and like I said, so personally enriching for me to hear all the stuff and have it part of my experience too. So thank you, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of everyone when I say this. So thank you very much.
You are so welcome.